In the small town of Fairview, Ohio, life seemed measured and predictable. Manicured lawns, cozy houses, friendly neighbors, all this created the illusion of an ideal American suburb. At the center of this story is an ordinary family at first glance, Catherine and David Miller, a couple who have lived together for almost 15 years. Catherine worked as an accountant at a local firm, and David was a sales manager at a company supplying building materials. Their life seemed stable: 2 children, a mortgage, an annual vacation on Lake Erie. But in 2018, their world began to collapse when Catherine discovered that her husband was hiding a dark secret. This secret was connected to the world of escort services, which eventually led to a tragedy that shook the entire town. This story began with small things: a random message that Catherine saw on her husband's phone, and ended with an event that no one in Fairview could have predicted. In the spring of 2018, Catherine Miller, 38, sat at the kitchen table, going over her family's budget. Her children, Michael, 12, and Sophie, 9, had gone to bed. Her husband, David, was working late, something that had become a habit lately. Catherine was used to his late arrivals, blaming his workload. But that night, she noticed something odd about their bank account. Over the past few months, there had been withdrawals that didn't match the family's typical spending habits. $200 here, $150 there, sometimes $300. The transactions were all labeled as services or online purchases. As an accountant, Catherine had always kept a close eye on her finances, and these amounts raised questions. She decided to check David's phone, which he had left charging in the living room. It wasn't her usual thing to do. She trusted her husband, but curiosity got the better of her. Opening his messages, she came across a conversation with an unknown number. The messages were short, but their content shocked her. Meet at 8, Main Street Hotel. Payment as usual, $250. Will be wearing a blue dress. Catherine scrolled further and found dozens more similar messages, sent and received over several months. She realized that her husband was probably using services that had nothing to do with his work. Catherine decided not to make a scene right away. She was a rational woman and wanted to gather more information. The next day, she began monitoring David's activity. She installed an app to track his phone, a move she had never considered before. The app showed that David frequented a certain area of town, far from his office. It was an area known for its motels and a less than stellar reputation. Catherine also checked his browser history on his home computer and found that he had visited websites offering escorts and personal encounters. Catherine spent the next few weeks trying to understand the scope of what was happening. She learned that David was spending thousands of dollars on these services. Her husband, whom she had thought was reliable and devoted, was leading a double life. But she didn't know that this was just the beginning. Catherine began to wonder, how long had this been going on? Who were these women? And most importantly, why was he doing this? She decided to hire a private investigator to get the answers she couldn't find on her own. The detective, whose name was Richard Klein, was an experienced specialist in cases involving adultery. He took on Catherine's case and began surveillance of David. He soon gave her a report. David was regularly meeting women at motels and hotels around town. Most of the encounters were with the same woman, whom the detective identified as 29-year-old Laura Wilson. Laura worked as an escort and was well known in certain circles in Fairview. She had a reputation for professionalism, but, as the detective discovered, she also had connections with people who were not entirely law-abiding. Catherine felt a mixture of anger and despair when she received this information. She did not know how to approach David and was afraid that exposure would destroy their family. But her anxiety increased when a detective reported that Laura Wilson had recently begun receiving threats from an unknown person. Someone was demanding money from her, threatening to expose her activities. Catherine began to suspect that David might have something to do with these threats. She decided that it was time to talk to her husband, but she did not know that this conversation would be the first step towards tragedy. At that moment, Catherine didn't realize that her discovery was just the tip of the iceberg. The situation David was involved in was far more complex and dangerous than she could have imagined. Her husband was caught up in a web of money, secrets, and people willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their interests. Catherine Miller decided it was time to talk to David. It was a Friday night in early June 2018, and the kids were visiting their grandmother. Catherine wanted to have a private conversation. When David got home around 9 p.m., she met him in the living room. He looked tired, but Catherine wasn't going to back down. She asked him point blank about the strange charges on their account and the messages she'd found on his phone. David turned pale, but tried to brush her off, claiming it was just business and that she'd misunderstood. But when pressed, he began to falter. He eventually admitted that he'd been escorting for about a year. He claimed it was a way to relieve stress and that it didn't mean anything. Catherine was stunned. She had expected denial or justification, but not such a frank truth. David insisted that his actions were not related to his feelings for her or the children, but Catherine could not accept his words. She demanded to know everything: who he had been seeing, how often, and why it had lasted so long. David mentioned Laura Wilson, the woman he had been seeing most often. He described her as a professional who was just doing her job, but he omitted any details that might explain why his meetings with Laura had become so regular. Catherine sensed that he was hiding something, but David refused to say more, promising that it would all be over. After this conversation, Catherine decided to continue her surveillance through Detective Richard Klein. She wanted to know if David had really stopped meeting and what his connection was with Laura Wilson. The detective reported that Laura was still working as an escort, but her behavior had changed. She became more cautious, avoided meeting in public places, and often looked over her shoulder, as if she was afraid of being followed. Klein also learned that Laura was involved with a man named Tony Carter, a local businessman with a dubious reputation. Tony owned several bars in Fairview and was rumored to be involved in shady schemes, including extortion and illegal dealings. Catherine began to suspect that David might be involved in something beyond just meeting Laura. She asked Klein to dig deeper. The detective discovered that David was transferring money not only to Laura, but also to an account linked to one of Tony Carter's bars. The amounts were small but regular, $500 every 2 weeks. It looked like payment for something more than escort services. Klein suspected that David might be involved in some kind of scheme, perhaps involving blackmail or debt. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread in Fairview. One of David's co-workers noticed that he was becoming nervous and distracted at work. Neighbors began to notice that Catherine and David were appearing together less often at local events. Tension in the Miller household was becoming noticeable, but no one knew the real reason. Catherine, trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy, continued to work and take care of the children, but her mind was on the investigation. She began to suspect that Laura Wilson might not just be a participant, but a key figure in this story. In early July 2018, the situation escalated. A detective informed Catherine that Laura had received new threats. Someone had left a note outside her apartment demanding the return of a large sum of money. Catherine began to wonder if David was the one threatening Laura to cover up his actions. But she also considered that someone else, perhaps Tony Carter, might have been involved. Catherine decided to meet Laura in person to find out the truth. She found her address through a detective and went to see her without telling David. The meeting was supposed to provide answers, but instead it only deepened the mystery surrounding her husband. Catherine Miller decided to meet Laura Wilson to find out what really connected her husband to this woman. In early July 2018, she drove to a small apartment building on the outskirts of Fairview where, according to Detective Richard Klein, Laura lived. The building was old, with peeling paint on the facade, but the area seemed quiet. Catherine knocked on the door of the third-floor apartment. A woman in her 30s with neatly coiffed hair and a wary look answered the door. It was Laura. Catherine introduced herself and immediately got down to business, asking about her connection to David. Laura, clearly not expecting such a visit, initially tried to evade the question, but when pressed, Catherine admitted that she had been seeing David as a client for a year. She emphasized that their relationship was strictly professional, with no personal attachment. However, Laura did reveal something that made Catherine wary. She said that several months ago, David had started asking her strange questions about her other clients, especially Tony Carter, a businessman with whom Laura occasionally worked. David wanted to know what services Carter had ordered and who else he had contact with. Laura declined to share details, but she noticed that David seemed increasingly nervous. She also mentioned that she had recently begun receiving threatening calls and notes demanding money. Laura thought it was related to her work, but she did not rule out the possibility that one of her clients, perhaps even David, might be involved. Catherine returned home with more questions. She wasn't sure whether to believe Laura, but her comments about Tony Carter confirmed the detective's suspicions. Catherine asked Klein to focus on Carter. The detective learned that Tony wasn't just a bar owner. According to local law enforcement, he was suspected of running illegal schemes, including money laundering through his establishments. Klein also discovered that David had met with Carter several times at one of his bars, the Rusty Anchor, in downtown Fairview. These meetings took place late at night, and Klein couldn't say for sure what they discussed, but he suspected that David might be involved in Carter's financial dealings. Meanwhile, tensions were mounting in the Miller household. David became even more withdrawn, often disappearing from home, citing work. Catherine noticed that he began checking his phone more often and even set a password on it, which he had not done before. She decided not to tell him that she had been seeing Laura, but continued to follow him through a detective. In mid-July, Klein reported that Laura had suddenly disappeared. Her apartment was empty, and neighbors said they had not seen her for several days. Catherine began to suspect the worst, but she did not want to share her fears with the police, fearing that it would draw attention to David and destroy their family. Klein continued to investigate and soon discovered that Laura had left a trail of bank transactions. She had withdrawn a large amount of money from her account the day before she disappeared and transferred the money to an unknown account. The detective also discovered that Tony Carter had been seen at a motel on the outskirts of town the night Laura was last seen. This increased Catherine's suspicions that Carter might be connected to her disappearance. She began to think that David might know something that Laura was hiding and that this could be the reason for his strange behavior. Catherine decided to talk to David again, but this time more insistently. She wanted to know what his connection to Carter was and why Laura had disappeared. However, when she brought up the subject, David reacted unexpectedly harshly. He accused Catherine of meddling in none of her business and said that he was trying to solve the problem without going into details. This conversation only increased her anxiety. Catherine began to suspect that her husband might be involved in something much more serious than she thought, and that Laura's disappearance was just part of the puzzle. By late July 2018, Catherine Miller felt like things were spiraling out of control. Laura Wilson's disappearance, David's strange behavior, and his connection to Tony Carter made it feel like she was in the middle of something much bigger than family drama. Catherine decided she couldn't rely on a private investigator anymore. She contacted the local Fairview Police Department and shared information about Laura, without directly mentioning David, so as not to draw suspicion on him. She reported her missing and passed on the information she received from Richard Klein, including information about Tony Carter and his possible involvement. The police began an investigation. Detective Stephen Harris, assigned to the case, quickly established that Laura Wilson was a known escort in Fairview, and that her activities attracted the attention of not only clients but also local criminals. Harris requested access to her bank accounts and discovered that before her disappearance, Laura had transferred $10,000 to an account registered to a company associated with one of Tony Carter's bars. This gave the police grounds to look more closely at Carter. He was called in for questioning, but claimed that he had not seen Laura for several weeks and was unaware of her plans. Meanwhile, Catherine continued to keep an eye on David. She noticed that he had become even more withdrawn, often retreating to the garage to talk on the phone. One night, she overheard him mentioning a debt and needing to get things settled. Catherine realized that David might be involved in a financial obligation to Carter. She again contacted Richard Klein, asking him to find out what exactly connected her husband to this man. The detective discovered that David had taken out a loan several months earlier from a company that turned out to be controlled by Carter. The amount was $20,000, and David seemed unable to pay it back on time. Klein suggested that Carter might be using Laura to blackmail David into repaying the loan. In early August, police received an anonymous call reporting suspicious activity at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Fairview. Officers arrived to find evidence of recent human presence, including empty bottles, cigarette butts, and several personal items, including a bracelet that Catherine later confirmed belonged to Laura. This was the first real evidence that something serious might have happened to Laura. Police began to look into the case as a possible kidnapping or worse. When Catherine learned of this, she decided she could no longer remain silent. She told Detective Harris of her suspicions about David and his connection to Laura and Carter. Harris called David in for questioning. He initially denied any involvement in Laura's disappearance, but when pressed, he admitted that he owed Carter money. He claimed that Laura had helped him make a deal with Carter, but refused to continue when she learned that Carter was threatening her. David insisted that he did not know what had happened to her, but his nervousness and evasive answers aroused the police's suspicions. At the same time, Richard Klein informed Catherine that he had found a witness, a bartender from the Rusty Anchor, who had seen Laura and Tony Carter arguing at the bar the day before she disappeared. The bartender claimed that Carter was furious and had threatened Laura with consequences if she did not comply with his demands. This information gave the police grounds to search Carter's bars. In one of them, they found documents confirming that Carter had been using Laura to gather dirt on his clients, including David. This discovery was a turning point in the investigation, but it also left Catherine with a difficult choice: whether to continue to defend her husband or fully cooperate with the police, risking the destruction of their family. By mid-August 2018, the investigation into Laura Wilson's disappearance in Fairview, Ohio, was gathering steam. Police, led by Detective Stephen Harris, were zeroing in on Tony Carter, whose connections to Laura and David Miller were becoming increasingly apparent. A search of one of his bars, the Rusty Anchor, turned up documents indicating that Carter was using Laura to gather incriminating information on customers, including David. The data, investigators believe, could be used for blackmail. Police also discovered that Carter owed money to larger crime figures in nearby Cleveland, making his actions even more desperate. Catherine Miller, torn between her desire to protect her family and her desire to learn the truth, decided to cooperate fully with the police. She gave Detective Harris all the information Richard Klein had collected, including information about David's debt to Carter. Catherine also reported an overheard conversation in which David mentioned a debt and the need to set things right. This increased the police's suspicions of David, but there was no evidence directly linking him to Laura's disappearance. Harris decided to have Carter followed, hoping he would lead them to more evidence. The police soon got a break. One of Carter's co-workers, arrested for a minor offense, agreed to cooperate in exchange for a lighter sentence. He said he saw Laura on the night of her disappearance in Carter's company in the abandoned warehouse where her bracelet had been found. According to the witness, Laura argued with Carter about money, which she refused to pay. The witness did not see what happened next, but he did notice that Carter returned to the bar that night in an extremely angry state. This information gave the police grounds to arrest Carter on suspicion of involvement in Laura's disappearance. During questioning, Carter initially denied everything, but when pressed for evidence, he began to talk. He admitted that Laura had been working for him, gathering information on clients, including David Miller. He said David owed him a large sum of money, and Laura was supposed to help persuade him to pay it. However, Laura, having learned of Carter's criminal connections, tried to back out of the game, threatening to expose his schemes. Carter claimed he had not harmed her, but admitted that their argument had gotten out of hand that night in the warehouse. He refused to elaborate, but police began to suspect that Laura may have been the victim of violence. Meanwhile, David, having learned of Carter's arrest, came to Catherine and told her everything for the first time in a long time. He admitted that he had fallen into debt trying to cover losses from bad investments that he had not told his wife about. Carter had offered him easy money through a scheme involving his bars, but later began blackmailing David using Laura. David claimed that he did not know about Laura's fate, but was afraid that Carter might go to extreme measures to keep him quiet. Catherine, having listened to her husband, realized that their marriage probably could not survive this, but her main concern now was the well-being of her children. The police soon conducted a second search of the warehouse and found evidence that indicated that Laura had not left the place alive. Although no body was found, the evidence gathered allowed Carter to be charged with a serious crime. David was also questioned, but his role was limited to financial fraud, and no direct evidence was found against him. Catherine, realizing that her family would never be the same, filed for divorce and began a new life, focusing on her children. By the fall of 2018, the Laura Wilson case had shaken Fairview, Ohio. Tony Carter was formally charged with involvement in Laura's disappearance, though the absence of her body hampered the investigation. Police had gathered enough evidence, including witness statements and surveillance footage, to charge Carter with a felony. His ties to Cleveland's underworld were also the subject of a separate investigation. David Miller escaped prosecution, but his reputation was in tatters. After Catherine's confession, he lost his job and their marriage was in tatters. Catherine and her children moved in with her sister in another city to start a new life. The story left many questions unanswered. What prompted David to hook up with Laura and make a deal with Carter? Was Laura a victim of circumstance, or did she knowingly enter into a dangerous game? The police never found her, and the case remained open, adding a layer of uncertainty to the tragedy. For Catherine, the biggest lesson was how quickly a normal life can be torn apart by hidden secrets. She blamed herself for not noticing David's problems sooner, but she knew she couldn't have prevented his choices. The residents of Fairview have long discussed what happened. For many, it was a reminder that even a quiet suburb can hide dark secrets. The story of Laura, David, and Catherine showed how personal decisions can have irreversible consequences, affecting not only a family, but an entire town.